Whether you digitize your embroidery designs in-house or outsource them, it's critical that you have the ability to edit your embroidery designs. The removal of a color change, the reduction of trims, the resequencing of your designs can all improve the performance of that design on your embroidery machine, which of course will lead to more profits in your back pocket. Now let's dive a little bit deeper into some of those editing capabilities of Wilcom Embroidery Studio 2025. Now I've got a series of very simple designs to highlight some of the editing capabilities in the Embroidery Studio software. I'm going to walk you through reshaping, how to adjust the shape and stitch angles, and also how to dive deeper into some of the object properties, adjusting the density, the underlay, and the pull compensation. Things that you'll probably do most of the time to optimize your embroidery design. And then we'll talk a little bit about sequencing to make sure your design runs with minimal color changes, which of course we all want on our embroidery machines. So with this very simple design, I have a run stitch object and then a very simple satin stitch object. And while I'm editing, I always want to make sure that I have my stitches turned on, my object outline turned on, and my stitch penetrations turned on, because they're the three key elements I want to keep an eye on while I'm reshaping and editing my design. And we'll start off with basic reshaping first. To reshape any object in Wilcom, first of all, select the object, then move over to the reshape icon and select that. That will then expose a couple of new icons or symbols depending on what type of object you've got selected. Now in this case, I've got a very simple run stitch. It's got a start point here, an end point there, and there's two little yellow nodes on either end where it's starting the object and coming across and finishing the object there. Now I can move them around to change the shape. It will automatically generate as I'm stitching or as I'm reshaping. And if I want to add new nodes against my line to change the shape, I can do a left click for straight nodes or a right click for curved nodes. Now once you've added a node, you can move it out. And of course, it will change and adjust the shape of your design. So again, I started with a straight, and then I change it to a curve node. Now, if you make a mistake, if you are reshaping and you put in a straight node, and you click and you make a straight node, and you meant to have made that to be a curved node, then while it's selected, just press the space bar on your keyboard, and that will change between that straight and that curved node. Now in Wilcom, the beziers are automatic. You don't need to click and drag and adjust it. They come on automatically. But if you prefer beziers, you can go up to Setup, Options, under Reshape, and you can change from traditional reshaping to Bezier reshaping. And then you will get those Bezier handles that you might be familiar with if you come from a graphic design background or use other software that uses the Bezier tool. So the choices are there for you to choose from. I'll go back to the classic or traditional method of reshaping. So run stitch is pretty simple. Start and end and a bunch of nodes along the way. Let's delete that and move down to a more complicated object, which is a satin column. Now in this example, I've built a satin column which has a narrow end, a wider middle, and back to a narrow end again. Again, if I select that object and go up to my reshape tool, it goes into reshape, but it looks a little bit different to that run stitch. I have some similar symbols. I've got my start point here and my end point over here. I also have some nodes, but this time the nodes are on either side of the object because it is a column. There's the yellow straight and the blue curved nodes, but I've also got this additional orange node sitting over the top of this column node. This is my stitch angle. Now when you go into reshape mode, you also get this reshape view toolbar that pops up. And from here you can turn on and off your different symbols. You can turn on and off your reshape nodes, on and off your start and end point. Zoom out a little bit more. And you can turn on and off your stitch angles as well. Now, just like that run stitch, you can move any of them around. I can make the column be a little wider by dragging that out. I can change the stitch angle by picking up that stitch angle and moving it off, and the angle pops up in a little tooltip for you, so you can see exactly the angle that you're positioning that at. So about 60 degrees, and it will change that stitch angle. Now I can bring it back and it will snap automatically back to that node. So when I'm moving that around again, it will continue to bring that stitch angle as well. Just like run, I can do a left click to add a straight node, or a right click to add a curved node. I can also add stitch angles to a column stitch by holding down the control key and clicking on the boundary of the object. It won't add a node, so it won't change the shape, but it will add a stitch angle, so you can at least adjust the stitch angle to get the effect that you're looking for. Now let's bring that back to similar original shape that I had, which is this shape here. Now again, when I go back to reshape mode, if you remember, I've got my start point and I've got my end point. So if I go home on that design and then travel by one stitch, you can see it's starting at that place where that green diamond was and is moving over to where that red cross was. Now if I go back to reshape mode and move my end point to position it halfway through the object, you can see it's now performed an automatic travel. So if I go home on my travel toolbar and then come down to travel by one, by right clicking, it is traveling one stitch at a time. Let's go a little bit more, 10 at a time. It's coming across to this point, then it's going to travel down here and come back over the top and end exactly where I told it to, so that if I do a new object, it is not performing a trim or a jump between those two. If that object was reshaped back to its original state and it ended over here, then I've got these big giant red trims to say, hey, your machine's going to cut. It's going to slow down and it's going to travel across and perform a little tie-in on this stitch here. So by reshaping, you can save yourself some time critical trims by making your machine run smoothly and jump from object to object without performing a tie-off and trim on your machine. Now, at the moment, my object just has satin stitch, and that's not the default the way it's generated in Wilcom. When you generate an object in Wilcom, it has underlay, pull compensation, and all those settings applied to that object by default for you. And it all depends on the sort of fabric you got selected as well when you're digitizing in Wilcom. But I've deliberately turned off the underlay, because you might get a design from a customer or an outsourcer where it doesn't have any underlay, or you're not happy with the underlay that's being used on that. So with your object selected, you can go right click and object properties, and then you'll be taken to the object property dialog box. And there's a couple of tabs that you want to pay particular attention to. First of all, it's the fill or the outline tab. If it's a fill object, your settings is of course on the fill tab. If it's a line object, then your settings is on the outline tab. We'll go back to the fill object, and this is a satin stitch with an auto spacing set to 90%. Now, if you want to set an exact spacing of, let's say, 0.42, you can turn off auto spacing and type in 0.42 and adjust exactly to the density that you want. So what's the difference between an exact density and auto spacing? Well, let's go back to auto spacing, and for the purpose of this demonstration, I'll make it 100%. Then I'm going to come into my object and reshape it again, and I'm going to reduce the width of that column here, reduce the width of this end column, and make this column longer. Now, what you might be able to tell on screen is that the density between these stitches here is wider than the density between these stitches here. Because when you have short stitches, you don't need it to be as dense. When you're getting long stitches, you do need to decrease that density. And that's exactly what the auto spacing does. When you click on settings, it will show you what the densities will be. If your stitch length is 0.1 of a mil, make the density 0.5 millimeters. If it goes all the way up to 8 millimeters, bring the density down to 0.34 millimeters. So if I go into my measure tool and press M on the keyboard and measure that length here is 1.1 millimeter long. If I now go up to this long stitch, that one is 6.8 millimeters long. So again, if I go back to my auto settings, the 1.1 mil would be pretty much around here between the 0.49 and the 0.48 millimeter density. And the 6.8 would be, well, roughly between the 6 and the 7. So around about the 3.6 to 3.5 spacing. That will set automatically for you when you use auto spacing. Now, if you want it to be a little bit dense or a little bit more open, you can change it to be 0.5 of a mil, and it will bring it down to 50% spacing, so it's really, really tight. Or you can go bring it all the way up to 200%, and it will double the values that were set in that auto spacing tablet. So by adjusting that, you'll get a nice density, but by using auto spacing, it will correctly adjust your spacing from the short to the long stitches. Now, the other important tab you want to pay attention to when editing is your Underlay tab. Now, again, with this object, I don't have any underlay turned on. And I did that deliberately just to show you how to adjust those underlay settings. And in Wilcom Embroidery Studio, we let you have two different underlays, a first and a second. Now, the underlay completely depends on what fabric or the object type or the product you're embroidering on, but we give you that control to have up to two. And generally, you might want to do a first underlay, which might be an edge run by default. So if I go back and stitch out that design again, it's coming through doing an edge run around the whole design and then doing my cover stitch over the top. If it's on a pile or a kind of a fleecy type fabric, you might want to flatten it down with a zigzag. So for your second underlay, you can put zigzag or maybe even double zigzag. Again, the choice is yours. So now if I go back and play that design again, it will do my first underlay as an edge run, then my second underlay as a double zigzag, and then my cover stitch back over the top again. And in all cases, you've got full control over the run length or the spacing, so you can have more or less underlay by just adjusting the settings on screen. Now, the next tab I want you to pay attention to when you're editing is under Pull Comp. Now, the Pull Comp tab is your pull compensation. Now, as you know, when you stitch out onto fabric and the bobbin pulls on that thread, it pulls it in a little bit more. So even though you might digitize a column that is exactly 10 millimeters, it might shrink down due to the pull effect on that thread down to 9.8 or 9.7, even lower depending on your fabric if it's stretchy or has a lot of pull. So when you digitize a column, and I bring on my grid, and we'll do a column that is exactly 10 millimeter by going grid to grid line and grid to, well, it's 10.3, almost exactly 10. When I press enter, you will notice that my stitch penetration goes out beyond that grid. Now, if you turn off your stitches and look at your outline, you can see that your outline matches exactly what you digitized. But the stitches, as represented by these small dots, or when you turn back on your stitches, it goes out beyond the object outline. And that's controlled by this pull comp value. Mine is set to 0.17. I can make it be 0.5, so it'll jump out even more. Or I can make it be 0.05, so it's even less. Again, you've got that control. And that pull compensation value will depend on the fabric that you are digitizing on as well. So that's a little bit about adjusting the properties. Again, the most important three tabs would be your Fill tab to look at the density of your object, the Underlay tab to make sure you've got the underlay to stabilize those stitches, and your pull compensation because you will be adjusting that a lot. Now, when you're looking at the settings between your objects and whether it connects or trims or does a tie-off, that's in another tab called the Connectors tab. And I've got a sample design to illustrate some of the changes that we've done in Embroidery Studio 2025 and the improvements to help you edit those connectors. Now, the first thing you'll notice is your connectors are highlighted on screen. You can't miss them. You can clearly see by the red triangle where it will be conducting a trim and by the circle where it does the first penetration after that trim. Now, every trim on the machine could be a potential issue for you depending on the object. Obviously, if they've got a good gap between them, you do want it to trim. But if it's just lettering, do you really want it to trim between each letter? One is going to slow down your machine. It's a chance that maybe the needle won't pick up the thread again and causes a thread break or slows down the machine. It just may not be desirable. It's completely up to you as an embroidery digitizer. But the way you control your connectors does vary depending whether it's a lettering object or a standard object. Now, in this lettering object, which if I open up my object property list, it is a complete lettering object, not shapes that look like lettering. This has a trim between every single letter, which again, you may not want. Now, when you are inspecting your trims, you want to make sure that first of all, you do have your show connectors turned on and that you do have your show functions turned on. With them not turned on, you're running blind. You have no idea that it's performing a trim on your machine. So do make sure both of these icons are turned on. Now, when I select the lettering object and again go right click properties, click on the connectors tab, because this is a single object and you want to modify the connectors inside that object, you want to change your connector settings from after object to inside object. And now you're modifying each and every single one of these red connectors that you see inside that lettering object. Now, my default settings are set up to trim after if the next connector is greater than 2 millimeters. What that means is if my next part of that lettering object is more than 2 millimeters away from the previous lettering object or the letter, then perform a trim. So I've got two ways I can fix that. I can simply turn my trims off and they're gone. If I turn on my true view, you can now clearly see that it is jumping between each letter without a trim. If I turn it back on again, they go away. But of course, it's clearly represented by those red symbols disappearing as well. Now, that's a quick way to do that. I've turned them off and I'm good to go. But what if this object had two words? Now I've got a problem. If I go back to my connector, my trims are turned off, which means I've got this big jump between my words, and I absolutely do not want that. So how do you fix that? Well, another option is again, go back to your connector value. It's a lettering object, so make sure it says inside object. Come down to if connector is greater than, and simply set a value that is more than the spacing between your two letters, but less than the spacing between your two words. So if I measure by pressing M on my keyboard, and it's roughly about 5 mil, nearly 6 mil between each letter. So I can simply set my connector value to be inside object, trim after if next connector is greater than 6 millimeter. It is no longer trimming between each letter, but it is trimming between each word. So again, if it is lettering, you do want to set it to be inside object. Now, you might also look at these connectors and go, well, look, these are pretty big stitches. That's going to stick up on top of my fabric and be really obvious. There is a neat trick to get rid of that stitch. First of all, you don't want it to trim. You want it to run nice and fast. So I'm happy with that value, but I don't want that to be so obvious. The default is jump. You can change that connector type to be a run stitch, and it will change that from being a single jump to a series of penetrations, which you can see by those stitch penetration symbols there. So it's gone from a jump from one stitch all the way over to the next stitch to a small little run stitch where it's running along and it's got a greater chance of sinking into that fabric and being less obvious than that big connector that's sitting over the top, especially if you're doing a fabric like a fleecy towel or a high pile like that. So that's inside a lettering object. Let's look between two separate objects. Now, between two separate objects, your first step you want to do when you are looking at your connectors is, can you save a trim by reshaping the object? Now, if I look at this object, it's starting here, stitching all the way down to this triangle, then jumping, trimming all the way up here, starting at this object and stitching down again. So the first thing I'm going to try to do is I'm going to select this object. I'm going to go to my reshape tool, and I'm going to move my start point down to be as close to that previous endpoint of that last object and see if that makes a difference. In that case, it hasn't made much of a difference because my objects are too far away. So now I've got some choices. I can either leave it as it is because I'm happy with it, or I can select that object. Again, go right click, properties, click on connectors. Because it is an object and there's another object, I want to change my connector type to be after object. Unlike lettering that's got lots of little objects inside, a single patch like a column A or a complex fill object is a single object. So I choose after object. And again, I've got my connector settings to say trim after if my next connector is 2 millimeters. So again, if I increase that up to 6, the spacing is greater than 6 mil, so it is no longer trimming. But if I move that object away slowly, well, not too far, it's already taken away that trim. There it's less than 6 mil. If I keep increasing it so it's greater than 6 millimeters away, it will automatically trim because my connector value is set to automatically do it if it is 6 mil. And that happens no matter what you do. Even if you reshape that object and pick up that node and make it closer, if it gets under that 6 mil, it will no longer trim. Now, in addition to your trim settings, you also have other settings for your connectors as well. I've changed my trim to only trim if it's greater than 6 mil, but my object is still tying in and tying off if that next object is more than 1 millimeter away. Now, this is purely up to you. You might want to keep your tie off value to always tie off, or tie off if it's less than 1 mil. Because it's quite a long stitch, and although on the machine you've told it not to trim, to save some time and jump across, there's every possibility that maybe the embroiderer says, you know what, that's pretty long, I'm going to grab out my scissors and just manually trim that away. Or maybe when your customer gets that design finished product, they take that garment and they trim off that small little stitch. If you don't perform a tie off at the end of that object, then if they cut that away, there's every chance that thread will start to unravel as that product goes through the wash. So while you can match it up and say match my top value and only do a tie off if it's greater than 6 millimeter, the risk is if they cut it away, that embroidery might unravel. But your choices are there, and you've got different choices of tie-offs as well and different settings. So play around those and see what makes sense for you and to get the result that you want on your embroidery machine. Now, another important part of editing is understanding the sequence of an embroidery design, because you want to optimize your color changes on a machine. You don't want it to jump around between colors unnecessarily, unless of course you're concerned about registration or movement on your machine. But in this case, I've got a very, very simple design. It's just a simple flower design that I've created with a bunch of petals and a little bit of a pollen in the middle. Now, I'm going to open up my color object list, which is this docker here. And this shows me the sequence of my embroidery design. So it shows me that it's doing the navy first and then the orange color next. And I can also see that by going slow redraw, which is Shift R on your computer, and it will slowly play through that design. I might slow that down a little bit and do that again. It's stitching through, doing my underlay first, then my satin stitch, and is doing object by object. And it's doing it nice and close, and again avoiding all those unnecessary trims. So it's doing all that blue without a trim, and then coming across and doing that yellow later. Now that's fine with a single object by itself because there's only one trim which is between the two colors, which of course I need. But if I grab this design and I duplicate this multiple times, So I right click on my mouse and drag and make one copy. Right click and drag and make another copy. Now visually on screen it still looks great. But again, if I go to that slow redraw, and we might speed this one up a little bit now, it will do all the blue of this flower, then the orange, all the blue of this flower, then the orange, and again. And if I go up to my design information panel and look under the design tab, it says it's got 2 colors, but it's performing 6 stops. So it's jumping back and forth and 5 color changes. 5 color changes for a 2 color design. That's not really optimizing it for production. So I've got a couple of ways that I can adjust this design. First of all, in my color object list, I can just pick up my matching colors and move them together. So pick up this blue and bring it up the top here, and pick up this blue and bring it up the top here. And now I've merged all my colors together, so it's performing all the blue first. And then coming back and doing all the yellow. There is another quick way to undo those changes. Bring it back to that original design again. Another way that you can resequence your design is go up to Arrange, Sequence, Optimize Color Changes. It will analyze your design and say, you know what, out of this design, we can optimize this from 5 color changes down to just 1 color change. Perfect. I click OK, and it will optimize that design for you, group all that blue together, group all that yellow together. So again, if I do slow redraw, it stitches all of my blue, finishing up by all of the yellow.